Rapid advances in medical science in the last 50 years have brought many blessings to us, but sometimes advancement in a field becomes a little too rapid for the safety of all concerned, and today we are somewhat apprehensive of the policies and practices in the areas of chemical medicine. We must not, however, fail to recognize that problems of this kind almost always have two or more sides. And we have to try to think through with reasonable minds the problems of the moment. Most of the medical research now going on is in the charge of great laboratories or pharmaceutical houses. These laboratories are certainly equipped better than any private clinic could possibly be. Research in these areas carried on with tremendous financial resources should result in a maximum of progress for all concerned. 50 years ago, the average physician was his own research chemist. He built his pattern of remedies around the common knowledge of his time and the older texts on these subjects, and he compounded most of his prescriptions himself. That is, he designed the compound and then passed it on to a pharmacist to fill for his customer or his patient. Many doctors of the old school whom I have discussed these problems with explained their position rather simply and clearly. They inherited, very often, a wide assortment of simple remedies from their predecessors. Young doctors frequently bought a practice, and with the practice came along the choice discoveries of the older physician who was retiring. As he went along in his own practice, the doctor very mildly experimented. But he experimented with rather simple materials in most cases, and his experimentations consisted largely of putting together what he felt to be somewhat more effective compounds. He was using almost entirely the same general group of remedies. He carried with him something that is now generally disappearing from medical practice, and that is the familiar little black bag. This was not only loaded with various instruments he might need, but contained usually within it an inner and smaller leather case with his medications. Very frequently, he simply left the medications he recommended with the patient. It was all part of his professional duties, and for this he received some magnanimous sums, such as $1 or $2 for a visit. We consider those the golden age of economical medicine. The physician also had about him an attitude that was quite different from that which we so often note today. The older doctor tried in every way possible to minimize the importance of an ailment. Naturally, he was observant for major symptoms, but he was not particularly patient with the professional hypochondriac. The person who had aches and pains all the time was medicated, usually with bicarbonate of soda. It might be called something else, but that was what the patient actually got. For colds, there were simple remedies, and for all these different problems, such common sense methods as the doctor himself could work out. He might well spend the whole night with the patient putting on hot compresses or something of that kind if he believed this would take care of the situation. Today it is quite a different problem. The modern physician, rather overwhelmed by his own education, considers nearly every ailment something of great seriousness. He is more likely to overestimate than to underestimate. He says this attitude is protective of the patient. Well, probably it is in some instances, because it's quite possible to overlook a very important symptom. Another reason why the modern physician perhaps is a little more cautious in these matters is because the danger of lawsuit hangs constantly over his head. If he fails in any detail, in what might be termed the most exhaustive analysis or examination or tests, he can be held responsible by the patient. And it is not at all unusual to have the physician roundly sued if any condition arises in which it can be proved that he did not use every possible method at his disposal. Well, every possible method at his disposal probably will include anywhere from $50 to $250 worth of laboratory work. He feels he has to do it. He feels that the patient is entitled to it, and so the old practice of medicine gradually disappears in a thunder of overhead. There is a tremendous rise in the cost of the practice of medicine. Not long ago, I discussed this problem with 2 or 3 pharmacists who I happen to be rather intimately acquainted with, and one of them brought out an interesting situation. He said, I'm going to leave the pharmacy business. I'm a registered graduate pharmacist. I put in almost as much time as the doctor has in learning my particular profession, but he says it's utterly wasted. It's almost a rarity to have a prescription come in that needs compounding. Practically the only thing, as he said, I am now, he said, I am a grocery clerk for the pharmaceutical houses. The medications come in bottles of 1,000. I simply pour so many of them into a smaller bottle, label it, and the prescription is finished. There is no more working with a pestle. There's no more finding rare and unusual chemicals or drugs to meet a highly specialized physician's requirements. It's simply exchanging pills from one bottle to another. This was to him rather tiring, and he said it absolutely brought his own education to nothing. All he needed to do now was to know how to read and write, and he had the thing under control. So he was going into another line of business because he was bored to death with simply pushing pills across a counter. He was also a little bit unhappy at the price of the pills, and he recognized the enormous increase in the cost of medication that has resulted from the general change of things. I've talked to a number of general practitioners in medicine, and most of them are also a little bit unhappy. They are unhappy because actually now, instead of being physicians in the best sense of the word, they are merely agents or retail distributors for these pills. Every morning the mail is loaded. The average doctor receives brochures and bulletins and announcements and reports on all the findings of these great laboratories. And as these laboratories are finding something nearly every minute, his mail is loaded. It is further loaded with boxes and packages and envelopes full of samples. Until today, the physician hardly knows what to do with his own samples. One doctor that I know of waits about every 90 days, bundles them up, and sends them to Korea. He feels that perhaps the physicians over there can use the free samples on these people who have no means to buy drugs. But he is unhappy because, as a physician, he cannot even begin to read the bulletins. He would not have any time left whatever for the practice of medicine. If he tried to analyze and break down all of these reports and tried to sincerely and honestly work with them, he would be so confused that he would hardly know what to recommend to anybody. He therefore, being a person usually pretty busy, follows lines of least resistance. He's not always sure of these lines, but he gets certain moral consolation in the fact that these remedies are sponsored by what are known as highly reputable firms. They are firms that write him and show him that these various medications have been under test and have been verified or have been worked with for a certain number of years before they are released, that the reports upon them have been favorable, and he feels that they are in a better position to judge this than he is. Now, most doctors also have patients who are not too wealthy or are a little inclined to be economical, even if they do have money. And for these, he usually keeps some of the samples. As a result of that, when someone needs something which he regards as not too serious, he digs in the sample drawer, finds something he thinks will help, and passes it on. In this way, he is contributing to the research projects of the pharmaceutical house. Because if unpleasant symptoms or something arise as a result of this medication, he is supposed to inform the laboratories or would consider it an ethical requirement to do so. So this great flood of medication is gradually moving the practice of medicine from the private physician to these pharmaceutical houses, with the physician acting as agent. He is distributing their products, and he is distributing them with the full belief, in most instances, that he is doing the best thing that he can for his patient. He takes the attitude that these people, with their millions of dollars worth of work, with their highly skilled men, many of them internationally famous scientists, that these persons should know more than he does and should be able to protect his patient's health better than he can. Because after all, one of the phases of this problem is that the so-called general practitioner is developing a frightful inferiority complex as to his own abilities. He is being overwhelmed by facts and statistics and ideas with which he is really unable to cope. Even the many years of medical education which he has received and his own practicing years have contributed so little in comparison to this mass of information that is coming to him every day. Of course, many of these preparations are attacking basic ailments which have not previously been coped with successfully, and the physician always feels hopeful that some patient with whom he has had long contact and who has no known chances of recovery may be helped by some of these recent discoveries. So it goes along in a kind of a humdrum way, except that more and more pills, capsules, tablets, and so forth are flowing into public consumption. And as must be expected, many of these are the result of over-optimism. Some of them are undoubtedly valuable products. Some are important in emergencies, but we are developing too many emergencies. The average person is not too thoughtful in his own attitude toward his health, and general carelessness is on the part of both the patient and, in a measure, the pharmaceutical houses. Now, most records, and I have read a great many of these bulletins and announcements from great chemical houses, after they have explained a product, after they have gone into great detail concerning the research program, the materials involved in it, the theory behind it, the records of cases treated with it, and so on, there's nearly always a little paragraph at the end. And this little paragraph is entitled Side Symptoms. In other words, what is the negative record of this particular medication? And the records may say something like this: in 1 in 100 cases, the individual develops nausea. In 1 in 50 cases, the individual breaks out with an edema of some kind. In 1 of 50 cases, we have a tendency to tachycardia or palpitation resulting from the taking of this material. Or 1 out of 500 individuals had marked difficulty with his eyes as a result of them. So there is this group of side symptoms. But this group is a comparatively small group, because if it exceeded, say, 1 out of 20 or 30, the drug would probably not be placed on the market. But these side symptoms seem to represent a personal reaction to the drug itself. Now the question arises is, how shall we decide whether the individual is likely to have a side symptom? Well, sometimes the informational material itself describes the kind of person or the kind of medical background for which this medication is not recommended. An individual, for instance, with hypothyroid should not take this particular ailment, or a diabetic should not take this particular medication. There is too much danger in that area. But even so, what generally happens is that the physician, finding something in which perhaps only 1 in 100 have had adverse reactions, and finding his patient in desperate need of some such help, will take a chance to see what he can learn. In doing this, he usually watches fairly closely for the appearance of these side symptoms. And if these side symptoms appear, he immediately orders the remedy to be discontinued. Now, this is all right, except it works another funny little hardship upon the world in general. And that is, after taking 3 or 4 pills out of a bottle that costs $20, and then find out that it has the wrong symptomological result, is quite a hardship on the private purse of the patient. He discovers himself in the possession of a large number of bottles, which cost him anywhere from $15 to $25 a bottle, which he can no longer take, which he cannot return, for which he will get no rebate, and which he cannot even give away. There's only one thing he can do with them, and that is to put them for disposal in a receptacle where no one else is likely to find them. He is not allowed to have them lying around or standing around. In due time, he may have other ailments arise. He doesn't dare use these pills again, so he has a total loss. In this way, the private purse of the people is contributing immensely to the cost of medical research. The pharmaceutical houses are using 175 million American guinea pigs to check these situations. Now, probably the main purpose involved is not merely to use the public as a guinea pig, but it still results in that in the last analysis, because finally all of these medications have to be tested on someone. And while I think most people are willing to contribute something to the common good and are interested in the advancement of knowledge, they're not interested in terms of sickness for themselves or the aggravation of their ailments. This brings the next issue to consideration, and that is whether or not this type of medication is actually required in most instances. The American is a peculiar animal. He has a private psychology of his own. As he says when he's buying or selling something, he wants results and he wants it quick. He wants to get the thing into the shape he feels it should be in. If he's miserable, he wants to get over it. If he's in pain, he wants the pain to stop right now. And as a result of that, he is demanding a tremendous support for health. He is demanding that symptoms be allayed instantly. He is also demanding that science shall now take from him practically all the burden of his own common sense. He does not expect to suffer at all. He does not expect to change his ways. He does not expect to give up any habits that might make him sick. He is waiting for science to find remedies by which he can do exactly as he please and enjoy good health. This is rather a difficult thing to accomplish. But because this is the public attitude, it is also highly exploited. The physician is in many instances practically forced to do things which he does not want to do, simply because of the tremendous demands of the patients. The patient is not interested in sitting down with a doctor and working out a health program. He is interested only in continuing to do exactly as he pleases. And it is up to the doctor to enable him to do this without injury, or at least with quick remedy in case injury appears. Many physicians have talked to me about these problems with their patients, that the patient simply will not use natural means. The reason he will not use natural means is because they are slow. Nature, working in its own private way, with certain cooperation, can correct a great many ailments for which we now have powerful drugs. But the remedies require the intelligent cooperation of the patient. One man told me that 40% of his patients would need no medication at all if they would reorganize their ways of living. But this is simply too much to ask. And even the private general practitioner today realizes that a large part of his pharmacopoeia is now being directed toward relieving emotional, mental stress symptoms. That the individual is tired. He wants a good, immediate pickup. The incredible sale of vitamins in this country is indicative of the general situation. There is undoubtedly a large number of instances in which these vitamins are worthless, but at the same time they are taken in immense quantities, simply because the individual hopes to find this quick pickup that he has associated with several strong cups of black coffee in the morning or the 5 o'clock alcoholic pickup. He wants to feel good, but he wants to live badly. Now, this is a test to almost any scientific body. You have to face this test. And, of course, the pharmaceutical houses have now developed magnificent public relations or publicity medium. As a result of that, our popular journals today are announcing medications and reporting them, which have not appeared as yet with any type of serious pronouncement in a scientific journal. In other words, very often the doctor learns of new remedies not from the pharmaceutical house, but from the patient himself. The patient has just read an article about it. The article said that this particular remedy was exactly what was indicated for his symptoms, and the doctor had better have it. At this moment, the doctor does not know that it exists. Looking it up afterwards, the doctor finds out that it is in an experimental state and that there is no probability of its release to the public for 3 years. But the patient doesn't even want to believe this. So in a way, the doctor is aggravated by the fact that increasing popular knowledge, not only of medications, but of semi or pseudo-scientific methodologies, causes the patient to diagnose his own case and go to the doctor to act merely as a means of getting the prescription which the patient has already decided he wants. This is embarrassing. If the physician doesn't give it to him, he simply goes to another doctor. To combat this semi-increasing knowledge on the part of the patient about his own health problems, which is often inaccurate, and still try to carry on a practice of medicine, places the doctor in many disadvantages. And but the one disadvantage is, as most of them will admit in private, whether they will in public or not, the great disadvantage is that the patient himself does not want to do anything to cooperate that requires anything except an expenditure of money. That's the only thing the patient wants to spend on the problem of getting well. The alcoholic does not want to stop drinking. He wants to have a wonder drug to get over the hangover. The individual who has bad eating habits wants to keep on with these habits. And if it's necessary for this individual to curb his appetites or to give up certain foods that are bad for him, he wants a general anesthesia to take while he is making the correction. He doesn't even have the willpower to do it without a tranquilizer or an appetite killer. In other words, if he wants to eat what he wants, the only way he will stop will be if his stomach returns it. So therefore, a drug has to be found in which the stomach will return it. And then the individual feels he has enough willpower there not to take the food that makes him deathly sick if he eats it. This is the only way in which he will cooperate. Now, this isn't true of everyone. There are a lot of very sincere people. But for an overwhelming percentage of those who go to seek medical help for miscellaneous ailments, this is essentially true. The patient is only interested in feeling better right now. The doctor, of course, finally comes to the realization that this is what the practice of medicine has deteriorated into. And we can't assume that the doctor is a person any different from any other human being. He lives on his profession. He wants to live as well as he can. He's just as much burdened by status symbols as anybody else. And he gradually loses his sympathy for his own patients. He loses the humanity in himself because these people will not cooperate with him. He finally gives up trying. Of course, he often will cooperate with a thoughtful patient, and this is true of even doctors who have a bad reputation in this phase of things. But having come to this peculiar impasse in which we are in now, we have to look a little further for the causes of it. We know that in spite of all the things that we say about the practice of medicine, that the records seem to indicate that we're living longer than we ever did before. In some way, we seem to be able to indicate that we have overcome a great many problems of health that were once desperate in this country and in the world. We know that we are able to lengthen human life considerably beyond the expectation of our grandfathers and their fathers. Now we come to another phase, therefore. We have gotten through with a great many early killers, that is, ailments which destroy young people. We have gotten past a good many of the deadly enemies of childhood and of adolescence and of early maturity. The individual is able to cope with those. As a result of this, the human body, lasting longer than it did, begins to reveal a series of ailments which perhaps 100 years ago very few lived long enough to contract or to know about. Thus we are now plagued with what might be termed the ailments of age, the ailments of bodies running down, the ailments of exhaustions, or the gradually accumulating results of intemperances of one kind or another. Now we have a large circle of late killers with which we have to work. As the pattern changes and these other types of ailments begin to appear, we know that a great many of them originate not in some quick or sudden infection or danger to the body, but in the gradual processes of the body's exhaustions. We know that the individual of 70 is subject to other kinds of ailments than the young person of 30 or 35. They may have some ailments in common, but there is a new pattern of sicknesses. And these sicknesses many of them arise in damage done earlier. In other words, when the individual reaches his 60s and 70s, he begins to catch up with his long-range mistakes. He begins to catch up with the patterns of emotional stress which he has endured through his younger years. If he lived too fast in his 30s, he has to slow up more than is normal in his 60s and 70s. He also realizes that a series of circumstances over which he has little control likewise begin to work upon him. And these, for instance, may be vocational ailments, results of perhaps being kept in an office hour after hour, year after year, and therefore the body not having adequate exercise. There is the problem of smog, and there is the problem of the nervous tensions of driving on freeways. There are all kinds of general social patterns that move in upon the person, resulting in the wear and tear of the body. And if he has been saved from earlier ailments, he now must face these. And most of these ailments have deep roots in practices or policies or attitudes which were established many years earlier. So the working with these more advanced problems presents a very difficult and somewhat unrewarding effort, inasmuch as the body itself cannot react as well in its older years as it has in its younger years. The individual does not recuperate as quickly. He has not as much internal vitality with which to combat the illnesses which may affect him. So the problem of medicating him back to health is much more severe than it is in the case of very young people who have great basic resistances. In the last 20 years, it is also notable, and doctors point that out, that the will to get well of older people is not as strong as it used to be. The average person today is pretty well worn out by the time these ailments catch up with him, and he is more inclined to adjust himself to the idea of a blessed release not too far distant. He isn't as anxious to continue his life. This is a very terrible indictment of society, but it is a situation which perhaps is somewhat the result of the development of the atomic bomb and other great fear mechanisms that have come upon us. Not long ago, one of our leading professors of medical science made the statement that the American people are the most over-medicated, over-inoculated, and over-operated people on earth. And this leads to the relationship between sickness and psychology. Today, the average person is uncomfortable. He is uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. He is therefore inclined to become a little neurotic. He is inclined to be a little despondent. He is inclined to develop negative attitudes. His fears are overwhelming his hopes, and his general attitudes are not conducive to health, vitality, or enthusiasm about living. As a result of these attitudes, conditions which perhaps would mean nothing to him if he was of a more optimistic nature, suddenly cause great fear and anxiety. The individual with mysterious pains which perhaps have no real meaning, simply fugitive discomforts that bodies are subject to, begins immediately to exaggerate these symptoms. And so today, due to publicity, due to every type of invitation imaginable, the individual rushes to his physician, often with really nothing of importance wrong with him. He is simply worried, frightened. He is using his own mind to disrupt the functions of his body. He therefore comes in as a sort of semi-psychological patient. He comes in and the doctor recognizes symptoms of extreme nervousness. Perhaps he reports poor appetite. Perhaps he also reports insomnia or difficulty with his work. He may have anything from dim vision to hard hearing without having any reason for having it. One of the most common things that I hear, for instance, of people who come to see me is that they're sick, they're miserable, and they've just had a physical examination and are in tip-top condition. This is a rather confusing state of affairs. To feel hopelessly uncomfortable and be in splendid health at the same time just doesn't seem to make sense. And yet, very often there's probably a great deal of truth in the fact there is nothing wrong with the body, or at least very little. Maybe nothing more than would be normally expected of an age group. But the person doesn't feel good. He is lackadaisical. He doesn't enjoy his work anymore. He doesn't have any fun out of life. He gets a little more tired, a little more depleted, a little more miserable every day. And he feels certain that there must be something desperately wrong with him. His friends all tell him that if he feels like that, he might be harboring the beginnings of some horrible ailment. He may be on the threshold of death and not know it. So he dashes madly to get some kind of help. When the doctor looks him over, there just isn't anything really wrong except that this person has beaten his own life into a pulp. And being in this state of constant agitation, irritation, discomfort, the physician is very likely to pass him along to a psychoanalyst, simply because there doesn't seem to be enough wrong, enough physically wrong, to justify the situation. Now, the psychoanalyst, or perhaps more correctly in cases of this kind, the medical psychologist, finds the same proposition. He finds a patient who has got very little wrong with him physically, and perhaps very little real reason to be exceptionally unhappy psychologically. But today we don't take anything with a good grace. If somebody looks at us out of the corner of their eye, we're ready to collapse. It used to be that when conditions arose that were difficult, we simply sat down and solved them. Or if obstacles appeared which seemed to interfere with the reasonable functions of things, we gathered up our resources and went to work on the obstacle and tore it apart piece by piece until we took care of it. But now, the moment we see an obstacle, we collapse. The moment a problem seems to take more than the most passing fancy, we can't handle it. And the same thing in the domestic problems of life. Situations which families would have handled without very much uproar, and perhaps hardly a passing ripple 25 years ago, will break a home today. There's no patience, there's no receptivity to solution. The individual has usually only one idea, and that is he is going to do exactly as he pleases. When he arrives at the psychologist with this type of a background, or perhaps his problem is a very real one. Perhaps it's just too big for him. Perhaps he is in a bad spot. We don't say that all of these problems are manufactured. There are some very serious problems. But in practice, the average physician finds that the really serious problems are about 1 out of every 5 who feels that he has a serious problem. The other 4 are simply exaggerating or are hopelessly below the ordinary level of being able to handle problems. So the individual, all mixed up, all tired out and feeling horrible, drops in on someone and expects them to take care of him. The problem of solving the situation simply does not seem to play any part in it. The individual who is selfish has absolutely no intentions of not being selfish. The individual who is irritable is going to be irritable, so help me, regardless of circumstances. there is no indication or intention on the part of the person to do anything about it. So, faced with a condition in which, for instance, you take a person who has been under heavy pressure, who has done something dishonest. The pressures remain. The situation isn't solved. The home is in uproar. The children are uncomfortable and underprivileged. Everything collaborates with everything else to form a disorder, a misery. So the person arrives, and the doctor, the psychologist, really doesn't know much what to do about this person. There is really no way of coping with these things unless the person himself wants to do something about it. He doesn't. All he wants is to spend money and have the symptoms removed. Well, as Buddha pointed out philosophically long, long ago, the only individual who has no problems is the individual who is unconscious. Therefore, the answer seems to be, dope this character into a state of insensibility and he will feel better. Furthermore, he will be back tomorrow for more of the same. He has now found somebody who really understands him. So various degrees of sedations and hypnotic drugs, tranquilizers, are introduced to take care of this problem. The individual with the tranquilizer is able to be a little more patient with the children. The individual with the tranquilizer apparently can escape some of the pressure of status symbolism. The individual with the tranquilizer isn't quite so unhappy if their car is 6 months old. Gradually, these tranquilizers reduce this horrible pressure, most of which arises in selfishness or vanity. So the theory is, if you keep this individual under an adequate tranquilizer for the rest of his life, other people could get along with him, and he could get along with them. He just has to live in this borderland of semi-comatoseness in order to be able to accept life at all. Naturally, the more you do this to him, the less he can stand, and the more and more he becomes dependent. Every time he has a brief moment of lucidity, he is right back where he started from. Now, there have been some suggestions that it might be possible to cut a few nerves in the brain and make it permanent. This seems to be very highly desirable to people who are simply unable to face life. They just cannot meet the pressures. What happened to these people 100 years ago, before we had tranquilizers? Well, the thing that saved them was the fact that life itself was more tranquil. They were not as ambitious. They were not as intense in their ways of life. They lived simply. They were not particularly concerned over the extravagances which we now consider to be absolute essentials, and as a result, they drifted through life and perhaps were regarded as mildly despondent, but nobody paid very much attention to them. Today, however, all this emerges with tremendous force, and we have a people, a world crying for help. A world in trouble all the time, and most of this trouble seemingly originating from the multiplication of internal pressures, the great tension cycles with which business and industry are burdened today. I talked to a man a couple of days ago who was connected with a small firm in this city that distributes mechanical goods. He is practically on the verge of a nervous breakdown, simply because of the tremendous competitive tension in even his small business. He is a salesman, and he is expected that his sales will increase, that the best day he ever had last year must be regarded as the worst day he can have this year and still be in business. This sort of problem causes him to fight morning, noon, and night to try to increase sales. He is getting a little more sick every day. Now, there seems to be no easy answer to this. So the individual, when this depletion catches up with him, has to do something about it. The depletion may take one of several forms. Under the energy reduction from which he suffers, he may begin to develop latent physical symptoms and come into some basic ailment, physical disease, which he has no longer the resistance to throw off. Or it may simply become part of a psychic pattern and begin to break down his psychic integration and bring him further and further into despondency and hopelessness, and may even lead to his becoming one of those people who annually add to our suicide list. So the problems are real as far as the person is concerned. But in our education, in our way of life, in our solution to problems, we have done nothing to provide the individual with constructive means of coping with these problems himself. His own philosophy of life has been totally neglected. His own religion rests too lightly upon him to be much use in time of emergency. He accepts it, he believes it, but he hasn't the courage to apply it. His understanding of his own nature is inadequate, and his ability to control himself is very, very faulty. He lacks cultural background, he lacks aesthetic interests, in many instances he lacks adequate avocational outlets. He may also have never been able to organize his family adequately, so that this situation rests as a chaos upon him. He is not able to convince his own family of a normal level upon which he can live in a healthy manner. They want more than he can provide, or perhaps gradually under these pressures he is able to provide less and less, and this causes further crisis and tension in his life. So battered in one way or another, or frightened to death, or both, the individual finally lands in the tender keeping of some medicalist of some kind or type. This person is supposed to put him together again, to get him back on his feet, to allow him to outsell all the other salesmen, and also to give him a dynamic personality in business and at home. It can't be done, but we all believe that it can be done. Now, the use of extreme medications, particularly what we call today these wonder drugs, drugs which are more powerful than any that have ever yet been known, drugs which move into the body not as a gentle friend, but as a dictator. These drugs enter into our physical, emotional, and psychical nature as autocrats, as absolute despots. They can force their will upon the body. They can force their effects upon the mind and emotion. There is no adequate way of resisting them. They move in without any regard for the actual life of the person. They don't care whether he deserves to get well or not. This is no part of the problem. They blast their way in and produce modifications which are often violent and extreme, but which we like to term immediate. Now, the body is not able to cope with many of them. They can be used and are indicated in certain cases. They are certainly indicated in a crisis where every resource must be used to preserve life itself. Where a person's life depends upon the use of one of these drugs, the danger is probably not as great as the provident or probable recovery factor. Therefore, they are legitimate to save life. They are legitimate as psychological drugs to take the individual over an immediate emergency. They may enable the person to recover sufficiently from a tremendous stress to be able to carry on. For example, a person who has been suddenly bereaved under very desperate circumstances, and whose emotional nature cannot stand this loss. This person can be helped for a few weeks until gradually nature moves in and takes over. There are ways in which tranquilizers, hypnotic drugs, anesthetics are very useful, very necessary, as in surgery and things of this nature. But the promiscuous using of them for every mood of the human being will ultimately result in a situation too dangerous and too destructive for us to be able to contemplate with a good conscience. Actually, we have very little in the way of knowing the effects of most of these drugs. The research that is done on them has been done as carefully, probably, as the researchers could carry it on. It has been carried on with selected groups. These medications have been tested, perhaps on animals and other forms of life, but the fact remains that the mutations caused by drugs may appear in a day. They may appear in a month or a year. They may not show up for 5 years or for 10 years. And they may not show up for 3 or 4 generations. These things we do not know. We are working with material, most of which is so recent in its development and discovery that its long-range effects are simply beyond our comprehension. We just do not know. Therefore, any drug which forces a violent change in the function of the body, any drug which forces any major change in the chemistry of the body, any drug which attacks the nerve system, or in any way paralyzes even temporarily normal functions of the body, the effects of such drugs must be considered as uncertain until perhaps several generations have passed. The thalidomide problem, which we have had recently, is indicative of the fact that the situation may not end in the body of the person, but may be transmitted. Now, all this makes this medication, instead of a golden age of getting over things, into a very serious period of cautious thinking, of care, and of attention to these problems which apparently we must be prepared to face. Thus it seems that in all materials which are introduced into the body as chemicals, as powerful outside agents, that these must be introduced even in the smallest dosages with a sincere prayer and a hope that they will not ultimately contribute more harm than good. We have to hope that the body will be able to get over the remedy, and that in doing this it will not have greater stress than it would have trying to get over the ailment. In the research projects, then, the fact comes out again and again to our attention that a great many of these medications, if used properly, if used with a thorough understanding between the pharmaceutical house, the physician, and the patient, might have very great temporary helping power. But the tendency to become addicted to pills or remedies is just as dangerous as any other form of addiction. And increasing dependence upon these wonder drugs by persons who may or may not really need them at all, but really only are trying to remove immediate symptoms which they do not have the courage or intelligence to cope with. This pattern is certain to result in serious disaster. There is no possible way of avoiding the implication, because even the best of these remedies is potentially dangerous if overused, or if the individual develops too great a dependence upon such remedies, where in small dosage they may be helpful, in overdosage they may be very difficult. A good example of this is a simple remedy like aspirin. I suppose we are the greatest aspirin addicts on earth. We take these little tablets by the hundreds of millions. There are people in this country that are taking 2 and 3 bottles a day of them. The individual has come to a point where he is an addict. Now, this type of addiction to anything is likely to prove the cause of more trouble than it ever cures. And the person, having taken medication of this kind for a long time, develops ailments of a serious nature, which he does not relate to the aspirin, and probably his physician does not either. And that is another problem in connection with attempting to check these ailments. An individual having over-medicated in some area, in years later developing certain ailments, there is a grave possibility that the truth of the matter will never be known. There will be no way in which we can then relate the present condition to over-medication. Or the individual who has been over-medicated may have taken enough to kill him in 5 years, and if we could see this case 5 years later, we would know it. But 3 years later, he is killed on the freeway, so we never have the evidence. Something else destroys him. But this does not mean that the medication might not have ultimately done him great harm. So the continuous problem of checking these things is something that the thoughtful person must constantly bear in mind. The medical psychologist is always looking for what he regards as the perfect patient. And the perfect patient is the one who, under counsel, under helpfulness, under guidance, and under leadership, will change his own nature, who will gradually awaken to his problem, who will realize that he has at all times within himself resources that are more solutional than the wonder drug. That the person may be in a confusion, in a period in which he is unable to gather his resources, and the doctor may find it advisable, if he can, to medicate the person through this emergency. But when life becomes a continual emergency, always to be met by medication, then all the doctor is doing, and he knows it himself, is putting off an evil day. He is trying to make the patient comfortable now, because that's what the patient wants. He wants to be comfortable now. He has no sense of cause and effect, or he wouldn't be in the trouble. So the real patient, the one that we all feel would be the perfect candidate to bear witness to a physician's skill, is the one who will use the information that is given to him, who will take the necessary instruction and do something about it in himself. But today, when we look inside of people, we find so often nothing but a dismal swamp there. They have no resources. They have no strength with which to face any decision that makes them do that which is necessary. Many years ago, for instance, we didn't have insulin. And as a result of that, the survival of a diabetic was largely a matter of self-discipline. I happen to know one diabetic who had contracted the disease or developed this disease when he was 42 years old. This man lived to 94 without an insulin. He never had any. They didn't have it in his day. But what did he do? His doctor told him very simply. He said, this you eat, this you do not eat. This you do, this you do not do. You check yourself periodically, I check you periodically. We keep this thing under control. And in an effort to prevent you from going crazy on a truly severe diabetic diet, Once a month, for one day, you can eat anything you want. From that time on, you must get over that one and get ready for the next one. You must live from month to month, looking forward to that one great meal in which you can have whatever you want. And the rest of the time, you've got to govern your appetite with an iron will and deviate from this ruling in nothing. The man did it, and he lived. And as so often the case with diabetics at that time, he died of something else. The problem today, however, is this will of iron isn't available. Now, we don't say that insulin is not a good crutch to the diabetic. It probably has helped a great many of them to stay alive. It has done a great deal of good in many instances. But here is a situation which is typical of a general problem, however. Namely, that the individual usually has two choices in the improvement of his health. If he has only one choice, if the ailment is such that he either has to take the medication or perish, then he must take the medication. But where there are choices, and there are in many instances, it is very wise to regard these choices. And if there is an easier way to reduce medication by the exercise of willpower, there is much to recommend this. There is much to recommend that the individual, if he does nothing more, at least completely cooperates. This will reduce the need of medication. This will reduce the probabilities of serious crises in which intense medication may have to be used. The person being kind to his body, giving it every possible opportunity to mend its own difficulties, will ultimately have less medicational pileup with which to cope. Another point that has been emphasized recently, and which I think is worth thinking about, and that is that many of these medications, as researched through, are apparently not too dangerous. But we have yet to try to work out the result of dumping a dozen of them, all different, into one person at the same time. Here we develop a problem of chemistry within the body. Here are remedies which in themselves may not be too serious, combined with others in a hopeless pattern, or followed by others, particularly accumulative types of medication, which do not easily or quickly leave the system, but which may accumulate to such degree as to cause a dangerous threshold 20 years later. What is the problem of the accumulation of all these different medications given to the individual constantly for one ailment or another, in terms of their possible effect upon his health through their compounding, through their multiplication within his own system, and because perhaps they set in motion diametrically opposed processes of the body, thus exhausting natural resources. One of the problems that we face, for instance, and which I think the wonder drug, in its more mild form, has played a large part in, is the effort to cure the common cold. Now here we have one of the best tests of this thing that I know of. Not long ago I knew an individual who, finding the advent of what appeared to be a very severe cold, likely to be most detrimental to an important undertaking, decided to go all out with the cooperation of all known products of the pharmaceutical industry to break up this cold. He went to his physician. He went every day. He paid well for the physician's time and very much better for the pills. In the course of 3 or 4 days, he had accumulated about $60 worth of pills. These he took with all thoroughness. 3 days later, he broke out from head to foot with a most unpleasant rash. A couple of days later, his face swelled up to twice its normal size. By that time, he could hardly see, and they had to start, of course, an entirely new group of medications to take care of these symptoms. This went on until the individual was thoroughly sick. And at the end of 14 days, he still had the cold. And everything else you could think of. Now, this type of thing is foolish. Anyone who has any experiences with colds knows that such medication for this type of an ailment is not indicated. It is not indicated to load the body with antihistamines and everything that you can think of, without any consideration for whether we are allergic to them or not, simply to get hold of a phenomenon which has always run its course, and apparently will have to until the actual specific for a cold is found. Then comes the next question: why a cold? Is the specific that is going to actually stop the cold going to work another hardship on the body which uses the cold to get rid of certain toxins or things of that nature? So if we continually block symptoms, are we not finally going to throw the body into another type of complete dis-ease? But our only thought today is to get rid of the symptoms. So I would say that the tendency of the moment is certainly for the wise and thoughtful person to try to cooperate when sickness arises with his physician, with a frank statement that he is perfectly willing to use natural methods. If these natural methods take longer, he is perfectly willing to take longer. That he is not asking the doctor to perform an immediate miracle. He wishes to be medicated as little as possible. He wishes all dangerous drugs to be left off unless the emergency is so great that survival itself is threatened. But he does not want the easy pill. He would rather sit down and take the few minutes that the doctor can afford to give him and find out what the doctor really thinks would help him as a natural course of procedure. If his doctor belongs at all to one of the older generations, he will probably have some very good ideas. Ideas which will not be violent, but which will follow old and accepted ways which have helped people to get well from common ailments for centuries. There is no need to force these tremendous drugs upon the body for minor conditions that may arise. If, as in the case of the psychological drugs, the hypnotics and things of this nature, the person will sit down and have a little heart-to-heart talk with himself, much can be accomplished. If he will really allow his counselor or whoever is trying to help him, if he does depend upon this person and have confidence in him, to try to help him to correct the cause of his trouble. Instead of fighting along, let him face his problem. If he is in a situation in which his own disposition has gotten him into trouble, if he is a smart man, he will face it. Because it is much better and safer for him to admit that he is wrong than to take the pills that bring him into a state of mind where he says, I don't care whether I was right or wrong. This will not solve anything. Now, we know that pressure is a very destructive thing. That pressure can destroy health and it can destroy sanity. And if a person is in hysterics or is in a state of such advanced psychotic pressure that he cannot be controlled, medication undoubtedly will have to be used. But along the way, if the person is thoughtful and watchful, he will not permit the pressure to reach this condition. He will move in upon his problem soon enough so that he can handle it or work with it by reasonable means. The lack of our ethical life the lack of our moral life, the lack of our spiritual culture, these make it necessary for the person to develop his own resources. And there is no doubt in the world that good philosophy is the greatest remedy for the sickness of the soul. That wisdom and understanding and patience and tolerance, these are the things which prevent tension from building. But our young people have no patience. They have no willingness to endure anything. They want to drive on their way. And of course they are the ones who are building up these tensions that must brutally move in upon them 20 or 30 years from now. We should have more emphasis everywhere upon what might be termed preventive medicine. We need to understand how we can keep well. And we should also realize that no matter how successfully we seem to recover from an ailment, if it is a serious ailment at all, we are never quite as good as we were before we had the ailment. We may be able to get along pretty well, but some damage has been done whenever the body has been permitted to reach a point of acute disease. Now, some acute diseases we know we can't prevent. We can't cope with them. We don't know how to work with them. Maybe someday we will. But we should try as much as we can to prevent the build-up of those over which we have the knowledge and understanding to make decisions. Thus, wherever we find the symptoms of not feeling well beginning to appear, it is up to us to look into our own lives and see if we haven't a good reason why we do not feel well. And if we would correct that reason, find out if we wouldn't feel a lot better without any pills at all. I'm certain that religion, if understood properly, would go a long way toward making many of these psychological drugs unnecessary. If the person had the power to find some core of quietude in himself, some piece of integration in his own nature, he would not need artificial tranquilizers. The world has lived without them for thousands of years. And in this period of time, many very great people have achieved wonderful victories over their own natures. It is perfectly possible to do this. But it's all now part of a general pattern. We won't walk a block if we can help it. We do not want to do anything that is not absolutely necessary. And as a result, our lives are dull, uninteresting, and unchallenging. We are gradually becoming utterly bored. And one of the most important type of medication we have now is that which tries to neutralize boredom. The individual who has no interest whatever in life, who has nothing he thinks worth doing, who hasn't anyone he cares anything about except himself, is already in a condition where it takes a very powerful pill to even make it possible for him to live with anybody. This is utterly unnecessary. And we might even wish and hope that the physician could reach the point where he simply wouldn't give pills to this kind of people. But now he is not able to do that, even if he wants to, because his skill is not great enough to be sure whether this person's ailments are all imaginary or not. He cannot he cannot pass judgment on his brother to that degree. And if this person is in trouble, it is almost his duty to try to do something to help him out of it. So he tries, but the patient himself is contributing to his own disaster. So I think in all people who are thoughtful and who are trying to do something good with life, to make things better for themselves, and to develop spiritual resources, I think it's very much better for them to feel in general that your extreme medication is a dangerous use of essential poisons, for the purpose of saving life. They will do it sometimes. And it will be a very stubborn individual who would not cooperate when it is necessary. But it is a foolish person who allows himself to take on this theory of medicine. This theory that we live in a world in which there's a pill for everything that is wrong. We rather should think of living in a world in which we must now build a strong and powerful defense against the pill. That the pill should be the last recourse and nothing else. And in every way possible, we should work with our own natures. In the psychological area of medication, the most commonly used medications today are the tranquilizers. They are the ones for the upset and nervous people. They are the ones to reduce the pressure of mental disease. They are the ones which help to limit the mood swings of the paranoid and things of this nature. In advanced mental disease, they are undoubtedly necessary, at least to a degree. But in the cases where the person is merely suffering from incipient symptomologies, where there's just some indications in this direction, here is where it should be stopped, and here is where the individual should realize that there is no relief from his trouble except himself. If he didn't believe that he could do as he pleased and get away with it, he probably would discipline his own life as people did 50 years ago. But now everything is so easy. This world of science is so wonderful that we expect this world of science to protect us from ourselves, and this it cannot do. We expect it to make all things miraculous. It has taken the place of all the magicians and conjurers of the ages. It is supposed that if it waves a wand and gives a small pill, the impossible will be achieved. This is wrong thinking. It's a very faulty attitude toward life. But it makes people too dependent upon the situations or processes outside of their own lives. As Buddha pointed out very clearly, we cannot ever achieve security by depending upon anything outside of ourselves. And this goes for medication as well as for social adjustment. The individual's integration is such that there is an intimate and eternal relationship between cause and effect. Whatever we do must result in consequence. The Buddhist formula on that is that when something arises, something must happen. And when something ceases to arise, then something will not happen. Thus, as long as there are causes in us which cause suffering to arise in us, this suffering may be variously interpreted. Wrong mental habits will result in mental suffering. Wrong emotional habits will result in emotional suffering. Wrong physical habits will result in wrong physical condition or physical suffering. Thus, the only way in which we can prevent this cause and effect sequence is to paralyze it, is to set up some artificial means which prohibits this sequence from functioning. But the mere fact that we block out the physical manifestation of a symptom does not mean that we have overcome the cause. It has nothing to do with the cause at all. It's even the same in psychoanalysis. You get an individual with a serious psychological condition, you work with him for 2 years and get him out of it, and you're just beginning to shake hands all around. When he has a new condition arise, it's just as bad or worse. Because he has not learned not to cause condition. He has gotten over one effect but he is already off on another tangent which is going to produce another effect just as serious. The core of himself has not been reached. This individual has not established a philosophy of life which prevents him from repeating his mistake or having a new one just as bad. If we could get some kind of education into the consciousness of the people of this country, if we could get them to realize that intelligence is the beginning of health, and that our own intelligence must prevent sickness. We have to protect our well-being with our own wisdom. No one else can do it for us. And the Indian idea of karma is the result of the things we do. Now, perhaps the very fact that we have become utterly dependent upon these physical remedies for causes that lie within us is that we are going now to suffer from the remedies. Nature is going to have its way. And if we have wrong attitudes on how to get well, we will remain sick. Out of this situation, then, there seems to be only one answer. In our generation, most people suffer from nerves. The only answer to nerves is relaxation. The individual in the midst of nervous tension does not know how to relax. Therefore, he takes some kind of a medication that will temporarily cut off the intensity of his relationship with things around him. He enters into a semi-dream state in which he lowers the amount of libido or energy which he turns to the consideration of some external thing that has become a problem. This is in formula exactly the same thing that Buddhist meditation was devised to achieve, except by natural means. Buddha believed definitely that it is necessary for the individual to reduce the intensity of his sensory perceptions in order to reduce the tension and pressure of environment upon himself. That to the degree that he deposited his consciousness and his safety and his security in the keeping of things outside of himself, the various things that happen to these externalized values afflict him tremendously. If he trusts someone else to make him happy, he then becomes actually the slave of that other person. That other person gradually develops a monopolistic power over him. This other person may gradually become a tyrant, or if they still remain a desirable person, they may be removed by death or circumstances and the happiness of the person himself destroyed. Anything that is beyond our control cannot safely be entrusted with our well-being. And anything outside of our own skin is actually beyond our control. We can influence it, we can try to dominate it, we can try to force it, but ultimately the laws of nature mean that everything outside of us will have its appearance and its disappearance, its coming and its going, and we cannot prevent it. This means that the only way in which we can gradually develop a way of life in which we do not come to these enormous pressure centers or complex periods is to no longer make our happiness, our health, our well-being, and our security dependent upon other persons and outside things. Well, this is exactly the philosophy that the tranquilizing drug points out. It points out definitely that the only way that we know at the present time to lower danger tension is to reduce consciousness. The individual must be less conscious, then he will hurt less. To meet this same situation, then, the idea of relaxation through certain disciplines, through the cultivation of convictions by means of which we release our minds from these dependencies. These are the only ways in which we can naturally accomplish this without shock. We can outgrow tension. We can outgrow attitudes. And this is nature's way. Nature wants us to wake up and outgrow the faults that produce sickness. To do this, we have to be thoughtful. We have to make the correction of these habits part of our lives. We cannot go along making all the mistakes and not having the consequences. And the tranquilizer becomes a complete symptom or symbol of what nature itself is trying to do. But the tranquilizer is doing it artificially, and it is doing it at the probable danger of injuring the nerve connections. Enough of this tranquilizer, and we have the individual who is truly sick, truly disoriented, and has lost control of his mental processes rather than aided in achieving mental integration. Whatever ultimately destroys the contacts between consciousness and the nerves, or will not any longer permit consciousness to manifest through the body in its reasonable way, any such method is a tyranny of some kind, a despotism imposed upon the functions which man has been given. The power that created man gave him the necessary functions to carry on his way of life. To in any way endanger these functions is to get into trouble. So for tranquilizing, try quiet understanding of the wisdom of life itself. For instead of a pill, sit down by yourself and try to think through your own convictions. And if you find that you have been pretty foolish, face it. And resolve as strongly as you can that you will not continue to be foolish. Now, you can have a certain little game that you can play with this if you want to. It might be termed outwitting the pill. It is a game in which every time you sit down and cure something in yourself, or set yourself a program of new interests and new activities which will meet the boredom and the stress and the tension which is building up. Every time you do this, you save money. You save the visit to the physician. You save time loss. You save these long trips to your analyst. You save anywhere from $15 to $25 an hour while you're with him. And you also save the tremendous cost of the tranquilizing prescriptions, which otherwise may keep you broke and give you something really serious to worry about. You can outwit a great part of this. If you are having a mental or emotional feud with someone, and it's making you sicker every minute, you can simply sit down quietly by yourself and work this out, realizing finally that you're going to have to measure this feud not in the revenge you attain on the other person, but in the damage that you are doing to yourself. Let us suppose that someone has injured you, and that you have a certain righteous indignation, that you don't get over it easily. And you keep on thinking of how you have been hurt and scheming on how you can retaliate in kind. Keep this up long enough and you will land on the analyst's couch. There's no other way you can solve it. And if you keep on long enough and dig in deeply enough and hate intensely enough, or let little small nuisance hates continue long enough, you're going to end on a tranquilizer. You're going to end not by solving something, but by gradually destroying your own brain and nervous system. You're going to gradually reach a point where you no longer have this pressure, but you are not also going to have the courage or intelligence or consciousness to do anything worthwhile with your life. You're going to slowly change into a mushroom or some other vegetation. You're going to lose every value in life, trying to get rid of the value you don't want. So you're really gaining nothing by keeping this feud alive. You're really giving the other person much more to chuckle over. Because if he doesn't like you, and you gradually destroy yourself disliking him, he is the one that appears to win, not you. Whereas if you end the feud immediately, either by solving the problem between the persons involved or else just giving up the effort and not wasting any more time and energy on it, wish the other person well and let them go their way. If you get it out of your consciousness, you're going to save money and you're going to have much more real value in life. It's the same way with dissatisfactions. If you can't have everything you want, enjoy what you have. If you can't keep up with the Joneses, remember they're trying to keep up with someone too. If you can't have all the new things you like, enjoy the old ones. And if you can't spend money all the time on things that are not necessary, realize that this freedom from spending sprees gives you more time and opportunity to do important things with your own consciousness. Build integrities, values, strength, and security inside yourself, and you will not need nearly so many pills. You will also find that you will be able to bear a certain reasonable amount of discomfort. One of the reasons why we have so much more pain apparently than we used to and are not able to carry it nearly as well is because this pain builds into our nervous tension pattern. Our nerves are acutely tired and pain hurts worse than probably ever before in the history of man. But as we relax, many pain factors are also reduced. And it is only under very severe and real circumstances that we are going to need anesthetic drugs. We are going to find that for many ailments which were discomforting while we were very nervous, that the discomfort is much less as we gradually take hold of our dispositions and work them out. I think, therefore, the only line of defense that we have against this endless stream of medication, catering to our selfishness, catering to our indifference, catering to our indolence, the only defense we have is our own willingness to be our own physician insofar as we can. Not to neglect ourselves when real need arises, but to try to build a foundation of health through proper obedience to the simple common laws of health which nature has revealed to us and which we all know. If we keep the simple rules, we will not have nearly so much danger of being involved in desperate situations. We do not need to face too many tranquilizers if we have tranquility as a quality of soul. We will not need too many mental depressants if our minds are by nature optimistic and naturally inclined to take things graciously and well. So for the whole problem, salvation from the pill is to free ourselves from the ailments for which the pill is intended. And as a large percentage of our most dangerous pills today are in the area of psychological medication, there we can do a great deal because we can put our own minds in order so that we do not need them. And our rewards are not only in what we say in medication, but our rewards are in a happier adjustment with ourselves, our friends, our families, greater productivity, greater earning power, greater ability to relax and be enjoyable, pleasant human beings. This is the thing we have to aim for. No pill can do it. No pill can leave you in the full control of your senses and at the same time change your mental attitude. So something has to be sacrificed. And I think wherever possible, we should sacrifice the pill. So that we have it in the background as a strength in an emergency, but that we do not let it take the place of our own attitudes and our own thoughts, and will not permit ourselves to be addicted to escape mechanisms, whether these mechanisms are mental and emotional running away, or whether these mechanisms are in form of drowning ourselves in some form of narcotic remedy. I think if we think this thing through, we can do a good deal to protect ourselves against being exposed to the pill, because it comes closest to us when we are sick. And if we try to keep well and keep straight, we are not going to have it even prescribed for us. And this is something that would be a great help, and I think might ultimately mean better health in later years if we do not compromise the future by these intensive and dangerous medications. Well, time is up, so we have Now I have several announcements to make. As you know, next Sunday, we have a guest speaker here on Sunday morning, Dr. Robert Gerard. You will find a note about him in the program, and I'm sure you will find that he has very interesting and valuable things to tell you. And I believe most of you have heard him before. He has been our guest on previous occasions. His subject is meditation techniques in psychotherapy. Now, this is just an indication of something that is happening, and I do believe that in a little way, our work over the years has helped to make it happen. Namely, that your esoteric disciplines, such as meditation, your concepts of Zen and Buddhism, and your ideas of self-help through inner enlightenment, these are moving into the psychological field, and actual groups of men are working with this direction to see if it won't help some problems which up to the present time have not responded well to treatment. This morning, our PRS Center study group meets, I should say this afternoon, right after the lecture of today, where the subject of the morning and other subjects of recent vintage will be discussed. The friends who are interested in getting together to talk about the lectures or expand some ideas on them are invited to gather upstairs after the meeting this morning and meet as guests of the headquarters center. They're all invited to be there. Also, I'd like to call attention to the fact that we have a series of little books on the table outside that we have secured in the East. They're not our books, but we find them very interesting. They're little small popular books, very nice little books. They sell for $1 a piece, bound volumes, which is very reasonable these days. And one of them is the Book of Tao, or the short classic work of Lao Tzu, which may be interesting to those especially who are coming to Wednesday evening lectures. There are also, I believe, some little books on Zen Buddhism, so you're invited to consider these on our book table. In the library, we have our usual exhibit. This month, you know, is the little ivory figures, the Netsky, and these are really quite a nice little group of enchanting, whimsical devices which were carved in Japan between the 17th and early 19th century as part of the only jewelry worn by a gentleman. They had no jewelry as we know it, and they wore a sash, and these little Netsky were the toggles or buttons by means of which things they needed to wear were attached to the sash. Things like their little purse and things of that nature. So they're very delightful things and quite curious. We also have a few of the Osaka actor prints on display in the library this afternoon. They're quite unusual. They have much more character and definition. They represent a very serious theater, and they have quite tremendous impact in these woodblock prints, which are originals and are about 100 years old. We also have some woodblock prints which are from genuine works of Harunobu, who lived, however, long ago. And these are original woodblock prints, but they are not the original prints. They are prints that were made by the native processes, but they are not contemporary. And of course, as a result of that, they're not priced in a contemporary range, but they're delightful things for rooms or for minor decorations, as they have a great deal of charm and gracious color and quite inexpensive. Also, I think our gift shop is open this morning. You will find some new and interesting items there. Every week now, some little something is coming in, and we have quite a few new things this week. Some very interesting cards, I believe. I sent back to Tuttle in Vermont to get them. They are the Hiroshige views, the wonderful views of Japan that he did as a woodcut artist years ago, over 100 years ago. And they're little miniatures, and they're in the form of note cards. And they're quite delightful in beautiful colors. And they are in little packages. And perhaps you'd like them for note cards. They're some very beautiful and charming studies. Note cards are becoming more and more interesting to us because they carry a little aesthetic message as well as our personal message. And I think these little cards will interest you. There are a number of other things, and we think you might like to see them. And now I think that is all the announcements. And I will be back again a week from next Sunday, and I believe we're going to discuss the horoscope of Los Angeles. And that might be of interest to people because we live here and because this undoubtedly is the most amazing area in the world today. Thank you very much. We'll see you 2 weeks from today.